The Archeology of Knowledge by Michel Foucault, Part 4, Chapter 4, The Comparative Facts. Archaeological analysis individualizes and describes discursive formations. That is, it must compare them, oppose them to one another in the simultaneity in which they are presented, distinguish them from those that do not belong to the same time scale, relate them on the basis of their specificity to the non-discursive practices that surround them and serve as a general element for them. In this, too, they are very different from epistemological or architectonic descriptions, which analyze the internal structure of a theory. Archaeological study is always in the plural. It operates in a great number of registers. It crosses interstices and gaps. It has its domain where unities are juxtaposed, separated, fix their crests, confront one another, and accentuate the white spaces between one another. When it is concerned with a particular type of discourse, that of psychiatry in Madness and Civilization, or that of medicine in Naissance de la Clinique, the birth of the clinic, it is in order to establish, by comparison, its chronological limits. It is also in order to describe, at the same time as them and in correlation with them, an institutional field, a set of events, practices, and political decisions, a sequence of economic processes that also involve demographic fluctuations, techniques of public assistance, manpower needs, different levels of unemployment, etc. But it may also, by a sort of lateral rapprochement, as in the order of things, put into operation several distinct positivities whose concomitant states are compared during a particular period and which are confronted with other types of discourse that have taken place at a given period. But all these analyses are very different from those usually practiced. Number one, in archaeological analysis, comparison is always limited and regional, far from wishing to reveal general forms. Archaeology tries to outline particular configurations. When one compares general grammar, the analysis of wealth and natural history in the classical period, it is not in order to regroup three manifestations, particularly charged with expressive value and hitherto strangely neglected, of a mentality that was general in the 17th and 18th centuries. It is not in order to reconstitute on the basis of a reduced model in a particular domain the forms of rationality that operated in the whole of classical science. It is not even to illuminate the less well-known profile of what we thought was a familiar cultural face. Our aim was not to show that men in the 18th century were, generally speaking, more interested in order than in history, in classification rather than development, in signs than the mechanisms of causality. Our aim was to reveal a well-determined set of discursive formations that have a number of describable relations between them. These relations do not spill over into adjacent domains, and they cannot be brought gradually closer to the totality of contemporary discourses, even less to what is usually called the classical spirit. They are closely confined to the triad being studied and are valid only in the domain specified. This interdiscursive group is itself, in its group form, related to other types of discourse, with the analysis of representation, the general theory of signs and ideology on the one hand, and with mathematics, algebraic analysis, and the attempt to establish a mathesis on the other. They are those internal and external relations that characterize natural history, the analysis of wealth, and general grammar as a specific group, and make it possible to recognize in them an interdiscursive configuration. There are those who would say, why do you not speak of cosmology, physiology, or biblical exegesis? Could not Lavoisier chemistry, or Euler's mathematics, or Vico's history have invalidated all the analysis to be found in the order of things? Are there not, in the inventive richness of the 18th century, many other ideas that do not fit into the rigid framework of archaeology? To such people, with their quite legitimate impatience, to all the counter examples which, as I am very well aware, they could supply, I will reply, of course. I not only admit that my analysis is limited, I want it so, I have made it so. What for me would be a counterexample would be precisely the possibility of saying all these relations that you have described in three particular formations, all these networks in which the theories of attribution, articulation, designation, and derivation are articulated upon one another, all that taxonomy that rests on a discontinuous characterization and a continuity of order are found uniformly and in the same way in geometry, rational mechanics, the physiology of humors and germs, biblical criticism, and emergent crystallography. This would, in fact, prove that I did not describe, as I claim to have done, a region of interpositivity. I would have characterized the spirit of, I would have characterized the spirit or science of a period, the very thing to which my whole enterprise is opposed. The relations that I have described are valid in order to define a particular configuration. They are not signs to describe the face of a culture in its totality. It is the friends of the Weltanschauung who will be disappointed. I insist that the description that I have undertaken is quite different from theirs. What for them is a lacuna, an omission, an error is, for me, a deliberate, methodical exclusion. But one might also say, you have compared general grammar with natural history and the analysis of wealth, but why not with history as it was practiced at the time, with biblical criticism and with rhetoric, with the theory of the fine arts? Wouldn't you then have discovered a quite different field of interpositivity? What privilege then has the one that you have described? Privilege none. It is only one of the describable groups. If, in fact, one took general grammar and tried to define its relations with the historical disciplines and textual criticism, one would certainly see the emergence of a quite different system of relations, and a description would reveal an interdiscursive network that was not identical with the first, but which would overlap at certain points. Similarly, the taxonomy of the naturalists might be compared not with grammar and economics, but with physiology and pathology. There, too, new interpositivities would emerge. One only has to compare the taxonomy, grammar, economic relations, analyzed in the order of things, with the taxonomy, pathology relations studied in Naissance de la Clinique. The number of such networks is not, therefore, defined in advance. Only the test of analysis can show whether they exist and which of them exist, that is, which can be described. Moreover, every discursive formation does not belong, necessarily at least, to only one of these systems, but enters simultaneously into several fields of relations in which it does not occupy the same place or exercise the same function. The taxonomy pathology relations are not isomorphic with the taxonomy grammar relations. The grammar analysis of wealth relations are not isomorphic with the grammar exegesis relations. The horizon of archaeology, therefore, is not a science, a rationality, a mentality, a culture. It is a tangle of interpositivities whose limits and points of intersection cannot be fixed in a single operation. Archaeology is a comparative analysis that is not intended to reduce the diversity of discourses and to outline the unity that must totalize them, but it is intended to divide up their diversity into different figures. Archaeological comparison does not have a unifying but a diversifying effect. Number 2, in confronting general grammar, natural history, and the analysis of wealth in the 17th and 18th centuries, one might wonder what ideas were shared at that time by linguists, naturalists, and economists. One might wonder what implicit postulates they shared despite the diversity of their theories, what general, perhaps unstated principles they obeyed. One might wonder what influence the analysis of language exercised on taxonomy, or what role the idea of an ordered nature played in the theory of wealth. One might also study the respective diffusion of these different types of discourse, the prestige accorded to each, the value attributed to it on account of its age, or, on the contrary, on account of its newness, or of its greater rigor, the channels of communication by which information was exchanged. Lastly, one might, as in quite traditional analysis, wonder to what extent Rousseau had transferred to the analysis of languages and their origin his knowledge and experience as a botanist. What common categories Turgot applied to the analysis of coinage and to the theory of language and etymology. How the idea of a universal, artificial, and perfect language had been taken up again and used by such classifiers as Linnaeus and Adanson. Of course, these questions would be legitimate, some of them at least, but none of them would be relevant to the level of archaeology. what archaeology wishes to uncover is primarily in the specificity and distance maintained in various discursive formations. The play of analogies and differences as they appear at the level of rules of formation. This implies 5 distinct tasks. Number A, to show how quite different discursive elements may be formed on the basis of similar rules. The concepts of general grammar, like those of verb, subject, complement, root, are formed on the basis of the same arrangements of the enunciative field. Theories of attribution, articulation, designation, and derivation as the very different, radically heterogeneous concepts of natural history and economy to show between different formations the archaeological isomorphisms, to show to what extent these rules do or do not apply in the same way, are or are not linked in the same order, are or are not arranged in accordance with the same model in different types of discourse. General grammar follows, and in the same order, the theory of attribution, the theory of articulation, the theory of designation, and the theory of derivation. Natural history and the analysis of wealth regroup the first 2 and the last 2, but they link each of them in the reverse order to define the archaeological model of each formation. Number C, to show how entirely different concepts, like those of value and specific character, or price and generic character, occupy a similar position in the ramification of their system of positivity, that they are therefore endowed with an archaeological isotopia. Although their domain of application, their degree of formalization, and above all their historical genesis make them quite alien to one another. Number D, to show, on the other hand, how a single notion, possibly designated by a single word, may cover 2 archaeologically distinct elements. The notions of origin and evolution have neither the same role, the same place, nor the same formation in the system of positivity of general grammar and natural history, to indicate the archaeological shifts. Number E, lastly, to show how, from one positivity to another, relations of subordination or complementarity may be established. Thus, in relation to the analysis of wealth and the analysis of species, the description of language plays a dominant role in the classical period, insofar as it is the theory of institutional signs that duplicate, mark, and represent the representation itself, to establish the archaeological correlations. So the archaeological, number A was archaeological isomorphisms. Number B was archaeological model. Number C. Number D is archaeological shifts. And number E is archaeological correlations. None of these descriptions is based on the attribution of influences, exchanges, transmitted information, or communications. Not that I wish to deny their existence, or deny that they could ever be the object of a description, but rather that I have tried to step back from them, to shift the level of attack of the analysis, to reveal what made them possible. To map the points at which the projection of one concept upon another could take place, to fix the isomorphism that made a transference of methods or techniques possible, to show the proximities, symmetries, or analogies that have made generalizations possible. In short, to describe the field of vectors and of differential receptivity, of permeability and impermeability that has been a condition of historical possibility for the interplay of exchanges. A configuration of interpositivity is not a group of neighboring disciplines. It is not only an observable phenomenon of resemblance. It is not only the overall relation of several discourses to this or that other discourse. It is the law of their communications. Because Rousseau and others reflected in turn on the ordering of the species and the origin of the languages, this does not mean that relations were made and exchanges occurred between taxonomy and grammar, or because Turgot, after Law and Petit, wished to treat coinage as a sign that economy and the theory of language were brought close together, and that their history still bears the trace of these attempts. It means, rather, if at least one is attempting to make an archaeological description, that the respective arrangements of these three positivities were such that, at the level of oeuvres, authors, individual existences, projects, and attempts, one can find such exchanges. Number 3, archaeology also reveals relations between discursive formations and non-discursive domains, like institutions, political events, economic practices and processes. These rapprochements are not intended to uncover great cultural continuities, nor to isolate mechanisms of causality before a set of enunciative facts, Archaeology does not ask what could have motivated them. The search for context of formulation, nor does it seek to rediscover what is expressed in them. The task of hermeneutics. It tries to determine how the rules of formation that govern it, and which characterize the positivity to which it belongs, may be linked to non-discursive systems. It seeks to define specific forms of articulation. Let us take the example of clinical medicine, whose establishment at the end of the 18th century is contemporary with a number of political events, economic phenomena, and institutional changes. Between these facts and the organization of hospital medicine, it is easy enough to suspect the existence of certain links, at least if one operates largely on intuition. But how can such links be analyzed? A symbolic analysis would see in the organizing of clinical medicine and in the historical processes that were concomitant with it two simultaneous expressions which reflect and symbolize one another, which serve each other as a mirror, and whose meanings are caught up in an endless play of reflexion. Two expressions that express nothing but the form that they share. Thus, medical ideas of organic solidarity, functional cohesion, tissular communication, and the abandonment of the classificatory principle of diseases in favor of an analysis of the bodily interactions might correspond in order to reflect them, but also to be reflected in them, to a political practice that is discovering, beneath still feudal stratifications, relations of functional type. Economic connexions, a society whose dependencies and reciprocities were to provide, in the form of society, the analogon of life. A causal analysis, on the other hand, would try to discover to what extent political changes or economic processes could determine the consciousness of scientists, the horizon and direction of their interests, their system of values, their way of perceiving things, the style of their rationality. Thus, at a period in which industrial capitalism was beginning to recalculate its manpower requirements, disease took on a social dimension. The maintenance of health, cure, public assistance for the poor and sick, the search for pathological causes and sites became a collective responsibility that must be assumed by the state. Hence, the value placed upon the body as a work tool, the care to rationalize medicine on the basis of the other sciences, the efforts to maintain the level of health of a population, the attention paid to therapy, aftercare, and the recording of long-term phenomena. Archaeology situates its analysis at another level. The phenomena of expression, reflections, and symbolization are for it merely the effects of an overall reading in search of formal analogies or translations of meaning. As for causal relations, they may be assigned to the level of the context or of the situation and their effect on the speaking subject. Both, in any case, can be mapped once one has defined the positivities in which they appear and the rules in accordance with which these positivities have been formed. The field of relations that characterizes a discursive formation is the locus in which symbolizations and effects may be perceived, situated, and determined. If archaeology brings medical discourse closer to a number of practices, it is in order to discover far less immediate relations than expression, but far more direct relations than those of a causality communicated through the consciousness of the speaking subjects. It wishes to show not how political practice, it wishes to show not how political practice has determined the meaning and form of medical discourse, but how and in what form it takes part in its conditions of emergence, insertion, and functioning. This relation may be assigned to several levels. First, to that of the division and delimitation of the medical object. Not, of course, that it was political practice that from the early 19th century imposed on medicine such new objects as tisular lesions or the anatomo-physiological correlations, but it opened up new fields for the mapping of medical objects. These fields are constituted by the mass of the population, administratively compartmented and supervised, gauged according to certain norms of life and health, and analyzed according to documentary and statistical forms of registration. They are also constituted by the great conscript armies of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period, with their specific form of medical control. They are also constituted by the institutions of hospital assistance that were defined at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries in relation to the economic needs of the time and to the reciprocal position of the social classes. One can also see the appearance of this relation of political practice to medical discourse in the status accorded to the doctor, who becomes not only the privileged but also virtually the exclusive enunciator of this discourse, in the form of institutional relation that the doctor may have with the hospitalized patient or with his private practice. in the modalities of teaching and diffusion that are prescribed or authorized for this knowledge. Lastly, one can grasp this correlation in the function that is attributed to medical discourse. So lastly, one can grasp this relation in the function that is attributed to medical discourse, or in the role that is required of it. When it is a question of judging individuals, making administrative decisions, laying down the norms of a society, translating in order to resolve or to conceal them conflicts of another order, giving models of a natural type to analysis of society and to the practices that concern it. It is not a question, then, of showing how the political practice of a given society constituted or modified the medical concepts and theoretical structure of pathology, but how medical discourse as a practice concerned with a particular field of objects finding itself in the hands of a certain number of statutorily designated individuals and having certain functions to exercise in society is articulated on practices that are external to it and which are not themselves of a discursive order. If in this analysis archaeology suspends the theme of expression and reflexion, if it refuses to see in discourse the surface of the symbolic projection of events or processes that are situated elsewhere, it is not in order to rediscover a causal sequence that might be described point by point and which would make it possible to relate a discovery and an event or a concept and a social structure but on the other hand, if it suspends such a causal analysis, if it wishes to avoid the necessary connection through the speaking subject, it is not in order to guarantee the sovereign sole independence of discourse. It is in order to discover the domain of existence and functioning of a discursive practice. In other words, the archaeological description of discourses is deployed in the dimension of a general history. It seeks to discover that whole domain of institutions, economic practices, processes, and social relations on which a discursive formation can be articulated. It tries to show how the autonomy of discourse and its specificity nevertheless do not give it the status of pure ideality and total historical independence. What it wishes to uncover is the particular level in which history can give place to definite types of discourse, which have their own type of historicity, and which are related to a whole set of various historicities. And that's the end of chapter 4 of part 4 of the Archeology of Knowledge.